In the marble halls of Windermere Palace, where centuries of tradition echo through golden corridors, a single moment of courage is about to shatter the carefully constructed world of England's most powerful family. Lord Charles Ashworth, heir to the ancient Duchy of Windermere, has spent his entire life walking the razor's edge between duty and desire. But when the woman he loves becomes the target of his stepmother's calculated cruelty, he must choose between the crown that awaits him and the heart that beats within him. Lady Catherine Melbourne, once a commoner who captured a prince's heart, now finds herself trapped in a web of palace intrigue where every smile hides a dagger and every curtsy conceals a conspiracy. The Duchess Camilla Ashworth, Charles's stepmother and the power behind the throne, has made it her mission to destroy Catherine's reputation and drive her from the royal circle forever. Tonight, in the grand ballroom where kings once danced and treaties were signed, three lives will collide in a confrontation that will echo through the ages. Charles will discover that sometimes the greatest act of nobility is not bowing to tradition, but having the courage to break it. Catherine will learn that true strength comes not from royal blood, but from the unbreakable spirit within. And Camilla will face the terrifying reality that some battles, once begun, can never be won. What happens when a future king chooses love over legacy? When a commoner refuses to bow to a duchess? When the very foundations of power tremble before the simple act of one man standing up and saying enough? The answer lies in the shadows of Windermere Palace, where tonight, everything changes forever. The autumn rain drummed against the towering windows of Windermere Palace like impatient fingers, each droplet carrying with it the weight of another dreary October evening. Lord Charles Ashworth stood in his private study, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass, watching the ancient oak trees bend and sway in the courtyard below. At 32, Charles possessed the kind of aristocratic handsomeness that graced magazine covers and society pages. But tonight, worry lines creased his brow, aging him beyond his years. The study itself was a monument to generations of Ashworth power. Oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the mahogany-paneled walls, their eyes seeming to follow Charles as he paced between towering bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes on statecraft, philosophy, and military strategy. The massive desk, carved from a single piece of English oak, bore the weight of state papers, correspondence, and the ornate seal of the Duchy of Windermere. Charles loosened his silk tie with trembling fingers, the events of the day replaying in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't escape. The memory of Lady Catherine Melbourne's pale face haunted him, the way her usually bright emerald eyes had dimmed with hurt and humiliation during the afternoon's garden party. Catherine, with her cascade of auburn hair and infectious laugh, had brought light into his carefully ordered world 2 years ago when they met at a charity gala. She wasn't born to nobility. Her father was a respected diplomat and her mother a celebrated pianist. But in the rigid hierarchy of the British aristocracy, she might as well have been a street sweeper's daughter. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9 times, its deep bronze notes echoing through the vast room. Charles knew that somewhere in the palace's east wing, Catherine was probably curled up in her guest chambers, trying to make sense of the afternoon's events. The Duchess Camilla Ashworth, his stepmother and the second wife of his late father, had orchestrated the entire humiliating spectacle with the precision of a military campaign. The garden party had been meant to celebrate the opening of the new children's wing at St. Margaret's Hospital, a cause close to Catherine's heart. She had worked tirelessly for months to organize the event, coordinating with hospital administrators, securing sponsors, and personally overseeing every detail from the floral arrangements to the catering menu. Charles had watched her passion for the project with growing admiration, her genuine desire to help others standing in stark contrast to the superficial charity work that occupied most of the aristocratic ladies in their circle. But Camilla had other plans. The Duchess, now 58 and still striking with her platinum blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, had spent the past 2 years systematically undermining Catherine's position in society. What had started as subtle snubs and calculated oversights had evolved into open warfare, with Catherine as the unwitting target and Charles caught helplessly in the crossfire. The afternoon's attack had been particularly vicious. As Catherine stood before the assembled crowd of nobility, preparing to give her opening remarks about the hospital project, Camilla had risen from her seat at the head table. The Duchess's voice had cut through the polite chatter like a blade. her tone sweet as poisoned honey as she thanked everyone for attending Lady Catherine's little project. "It's so refreshing," Camilla had continued, her smile never wavering, "to see someone from a more modest background taking such an interest in charitable work. Of course, those of us born to service understand that true philanthropy requires more than enthusiasm. It requires breeding, connections, and an understanding of our responsibilities that comes from generations of noble blood." The words had landed like physical blows, and Charles had watched helplessly as Catherine's confident posture crumbled. The assembled guests, a mixture of peers, politicians, and wealthy donors, had shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked embarrassed by Camilla's cruelty, others nodded in agreement, but all understood the message. Catherine Melbourne did not belong in their world. What made the attack even more devastating was Catherine's inability to respond. Royal protocol and social etiquette demanded that she accept the insult with grace, smile politely, and continue with her prepared remarks. Charles had seen the exact moment when Catherine's spirit broke, the way her shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly before she straightened them again with visible effort. The rest of the afternoon had passed in a blur of stilted conversations and meaningful glances. Charles had tried to stay close to Catherine, offering what support he could through subtle gestures and reassuring touches, but the damage was done. By evening, whispers about Catherine's inappropriate ambitions and social climbing were already circulating through the palace corridors. Now, alone in his study, Charles felt the weight of his birthright like chains around his ankles. The Duchy of Windermere was one of the oldest and most powerful noble houses in England, its influence stretching back over 8 centuries. Charles's ancestors had served kings and queens, led armies into battle, and shaped the destiny of nations. The family motto, "Honor before all," was carved into the marble lintel above the fireplace, a constant reminder of the standards he was expected to uphold. But what was honor when the woman he loved was being systematically destroyed by his own family? What was nobility when it was used as a weapon against the innocent? Charles moved to the fireplace, where logs crackled and hissed in the ornate grate. Above the mantel hung a portrait of his father, the late Duke Edmund Ashworth, painted just before his death 5 years ago. Edmund had been a man of unwavering principles, devoted to duty and tradition above all else. He had married Charles's mother, Lady Victoria Pemberton, in a union that perfectly joined 2 of England's most distinguished families. When Victoria died in a riding accident when Charles was 15, Edmund had grieved for exactly 1 year before marrying Camilla, the widowed Lady Forsyth, in what was widely regarded as a practical alliance rather than a love match. Charles had never questioned his father's decisions, accepting them as part of the natural order of aristocratic life. But now, staring into Edmund's painted eyes, he wondered if his father had ever faced a choice between duty and love. Had there ever been a moment when Edmund Ashworth had to choose between his heart and his heritage? The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside interrupted Charles's brooding. 3 sharp raps on the heavy oak door announced a visitor, and Charles straightened his shoulders instinctively before calling for them to enter. The door opened to reveal Jenkins, the head butler, a man so perfectly suited to his role that he seemed to have been carved from the same wood as the palace itself. Jenkins had served the Ashworth family for 37 years, his discreet efficiency and unshakable loyalty making him privy to more family secrets than any priest or confidant. "Your Grace," Jenkins said, his voice carrying its usual tone of respectful formality, "the Duchess Camilla requests your presence in the blue drawing room at your earliest convenience." Charles suppressed a grimace. The blue drawing room was Camilla's preferred venue for difficult conversations, its formal atmosphere and strategic seating arrangement designed to put visitors at a psychological disadvantage. The request, phrased as it was, left no room for refusal. "Tell her Grace I'll be along presently," Charles replied, adjusting his tie with practiced motions. Jenkins hesitated for a moment, an unusual display of uncertainty that caught Charles's attention. "If I may, Your Grace," the butler continued, his voice dropping to a more personal tone, "Lady Catherine has not emerged from her chambers since returning from the garden party. Mrs. Whitmore attempted to bring her dinner, but she declined to receive it." The information hit Charles like a physical blow. Catherine's absence from dinner hadn't gone unnoticed, and her refusal to eat suggested a level of distress that worried him deeply. In the 2 years he had known her, Catherine had faced every challenge with remarkable resilience, but This afternoon's public humiliation seemed to have broken something fundamental in her spirit. "Thank you, Jenkins," Charles said quietly. "Please have Mrs. Whitmore prepare something light for Lady Catherine. Perhaps some soup and tea. Tell her it comes with my personal compliments, and that I hope she feels better soon." "Of course, Your Grace," Jenkins replied with a slight bow. As he turned to leave, he paused once more. "Your Grace, if I may observe, the staff holds Lady Catherine in very high regard. Her kindness to the household has not gone unnoticed." The butler's words carried more weight than any political endorsement. The servants at Windermere Palace had seen generations of nobility come and go, and their judgment of character was both swift and accurate. If they supported Catherine, it spoke volumes about her true nature. Alone again, Charles made his way through the palace's labyrinthine corridors toward the blue drawing room. The walls were lined with centuries of collected art, from medieval tapestries depicting hunting scenes to Renaissance portraits of long-dead Ashworths. Electric chandeliers had replaced the original candles decades ago, but the fixtures maintained their ornate crystal elegance, casting prismatic rainbows across the polished marble floors. The blue drawing room occupied a corner of the palace's main floor, its tall windows offering views of both the formal gardens and the distant rolling hills of the estate. The room's name came from the elaborate blue and gold wallpaper that covered its walls, a pattern of interlocking peacock feathers that had been installed during the Victorian era. Antique furniture upholstered in matching blue silk created conversation areas throughout the space, while a magnificent Persian carpet anchored the central seating arrangement. Camilla was waiting for him in her usual chair, a high-backed throne-like piece that had been her preferred seat since becoming Duchess. She had changed from her afternoon ensemble into a formal evening gown of deep burgundy silk, her platinum hair styled in an elegant chignon that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Diamonds glittered at her throat, and ears, family heirlooms that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and power. "Charles," she said as he entered, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when delivering lectures. "Please sit down. We need to talk." Charles chose a chair across from her, maintaining enough distance to feel independent while still observing the proper protocols of filial respect. The fireplace behind Camilla cast her in dramatic silhouette, an effect she had no doubt calculated for maximum impact. "I trust you've had time to reflect on this afternoon's events," Camilla began, her hands folded precisely in her lap. "The garden party was quite successful, despite certain awkward moments." "Awkward moments that you created," Charles replied, his voice carefully controlled but firm. "Catherine worked incredibly hard on that event, and she deserved better than public humiliation." Camilla's eyebrows rose slightly, a gesture that managed to convey both surprise and disapproval. "Public humiliation? Really, Charles, I think you're being rather dramatic. I simply reminded everyone of the proper order of things. Lady Catherine may be charming, but she lacks the breeding and understanding necessary for a woman in her position." "Her position?" Charles leaned forward slightly. "And what position is that, exactly?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Camilla's blue eyes studied Charles with the intensity of a chess master considering her next move. When she spoke again, her voice carried a steel edge that had intimidated lesser nobles for decades. "The position she seems to imagine herself occupying as your future wife," Camilla said bluntly. "Really, Charles, surely you don't think I'm blind to what's been developing between you two. The lingering glances, the intimate conversations, the way you hover protectively whenever she's in a room. It's all quite transparent, and frankly, it's becoming embarrassing." Charles felt heat rise in his cheeks, but he forced himself to remain calm. "My feelings for Catherine are not a matter for public discussion, nor are they subject to your approval." "On the contrary," Camilla replied sharply, "your feelings are very much my concern when they threaten the reputation and future of this family. You are the heir to one of England's most distinguished dukedoms, Charles. Your eventual marriage is not simply a personal choice. It's a matter of strategic importance that will affect generations of Ashworths to come." The familiar arguments rolled over Charles like waves against a seawall. He had heard variations of this lecture since childhood, the constant reminders of his duty to family, tradition, and bloodline. His eventual wife would need to bring appropriate connections, social standing, and the kind of impeccable breeding that would ensure the continued prominence of the Ashworth name. "Catherine comes from a perfectly respectable family," Charles said, though he knew the weakness of his argument even as he spoke. "Her father serves the crown with distinction, and her mother is a musician, Camilla interrupted dismissively. A talented one, perhaps, but a performer nonetheless. Charles, you cannot seriously be considering marrying a woman whose mother earned money by playing piano at society gatherings. The very idea is preposterous. So we should judge people by their parents' occupations rather than their own character? Charles shot back. Catherine has dedicated her life to charitable work. She's educated, articulate, and genuinely cares about making a difference in the world. Isn't that worth more than an ancient family name? Camilla's laugh was sharp and humorless. Oh, my dear boy, how wonderfully naive you sound. Character is all very well for the middle classes, but we operate by different rules. We have responsibilities that transcend personal preference. Your great-grandfather understood this when he married Lady Margaret Thornfield despite being desperately in love with his cousin's governess. Your grandfather knew it when he chose your grandmother over the Italian Contessa who captured his heart during the war. And your father certainly understood it when he married your mother. The mention of his parents stung, particularly the implication that his father's marriage had been purely strategic. Charles had grown up believing his parents shared a great love story, but Camilla's words planted seeds of doubt that he found deeply unsettling. Even if that were true, Charles said slowly, times have changed. The aristocracy has evolved, and marriages between classes are no longer unthinkable. Evolved. Camilla's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. Charles, the aristocracy has survived for 1,000 years precisely because it has not evolved beyond recognition. We maintain our position through careful alliances, strategic marriages, and the preservation of bloodlines that trace back to the Norman conquest. The moment we start treating our heritage as negotiable, we begin the process of our own destruction. She stood abruptly, moving to the window where the last light of evening painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman still beautiful but hardened by years of protecting her position in a world where a single misstep could mean social exile. I've watched other noble families make the mistakes you're contemplating, she continued, her voice now carrying a note of genuine concern. The Duke of Ravenswood married that American actress and lost half his political influence within a year. Lord Pemberton's son chose that activist woman, and their family name became synonymous with scandal. Is that what you want for the Ashworth legacy? Charles joined her at the window, the two of them standing side by side as they looked out at the estate that had been his playground as a child, and would someday be his responsibility to manage and preserve. The weight of that future pressed down on him like a physical burden. What I want, Charles said quietly, is to find happiness while still honoring my family's legacy. Surely those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. Camilla turned to face him fully, her expression softening slightly into something that might have been maternal affection if not for the calculating intelligence behind her eyes. Charles, I'm not your enemy in this. Everything I do is for the good of this family and your future. Lady Catherine may be a lovely person, but she is simply not suitable to be the next Duchess of Windermere. The sooner you accept that reality and distance yourself from her, the easier it will be for everyone involved. And if I refuse? Charles asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Camilla's smile was sharp as winter frost. Then, I will be forced to take more decisive action to protect this family's interests. Lady Catherine's presence here is becoming increasingly awkward, and there are several ways that situation could be resolved. I'm hoping you'll choose the dignified path that allows everyone to maintain their reputation intact. The threat was delivered with such polite courtesy that it took Charles a moment to fully process its implications. Camilla was not merely disapproving of his relationship with Catherine, she was actively working to destroy it. And she had just revealed that today's humiliation was only the beginning. You would ruin an innocent woman to get your way? Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I would protect my family from a potentially damaging alliance, Camilla corrected. The distinction is important, Charles. Lady Catherine chose to pursue a relationship above her station, and she must accept the consequences of that choice. I'm simply ensuring those consequences become clear before any irreversible damage is done. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Jenkins entered at Camilla's summons, his expression carefully neutral as he approached. Your Grace, he said, addressing Camilla with a slight bow. Lady Catherine's maid reports that she is feeling quite unwell and will be unable to join the family for breakfast tomorrow morning. She sends her regrets and hopes to feel better soon. The message was clearly a polite fiction designed to give Catherine an excuse to avoid another potential confrontation. But Charles felt his heart sink at the thought of her suffering alone in her chambers. He started to speak, perhaps to suggest that a doctor be called, but Camilla's voice cut across his. "Please give Lady Catherine our best wishes for a swift recovery," the Duchess said smoothly. "And inform her that I've taken the liberty of arranging transportation back to London for Thursday morning. I thought she might appreciate the opportunity to recover in the comfort of her own home." Jenkins's carefully maintained composure slipped almost imperceptibly, his eyes flickering toward Charles with something that might have been concern or apology. The butler was too well trained to question a direct order from the Duchess, but his discomfort was evident to anyone who knew how to read his subtle expressions. Charles felt the world tilt slightly around him. Thursday was only 2 days away, and once Catherine left Windermere Palace, he knew instinctively that Camilla would ensure she never returned. This was his stepmother's endgame, the decisive move that would separate him from Catherine permanently while maintaining the facade of gracious hospitality. "That won't be necessary," Charles heard himself say, his voice sounding strange and distant to his own ears. "Lady Catherine is my guest, and she'll leave when she chooses to leave." The silence that followed his words was deafening. Jenkins stood frozen between the two nobles like a deer caught between hunters, while Camilla's face slowly transformed from surprise to cold fury. "I beg your pardon," she said, each word articulated with crystalline precision. "You heard me correctly," Charles replied, finding strength in his own voice as he spoke. "Catherine is my guest, invited at my request, and I will not have her treated as an unwelcome burden in my own home." Camilla's composure, so carefully maintained throughout their conversation, finally cracked completely. Her face flushed with anger, and when she spoke, her voice carried a venom that Charles had never heard directed at him before. "Your home," she hissed. "This is my home, Charles, granted to me by your father's will, and maintained through my efforts for the past 5 years. You may be the heir, but you are not yet the Duke, and while I draw breath, I will not tolerate disrespect under this roof." The room seemed to shrink around them as generations of family dynamics crystallized into this single moment of confrontation. Charles realized that his entire future hung in the balance of what happened next, that his response would determine not only Catherine's fate, but his own path forward as a man and as a future duke. The morning after his confrontation with Camilla dawned gray and miserable, with thick fog rolling across the Windermere estate like a physical manifestation of Charles's troubled thoughts. He had barely slept, spending most of the night pacing his chambers and replaying the evening's events in his mind. The memory of Camilla's fury when he challenged her authority still sent cold fingers of dread crawling up his spine, but beneath the fear lay something stronger, a growing determination to protect Catherine at any cost. Charles dressed carefully in his riding clothes, hoping that a morning gallop across the estate might clear his head and help him devise a strategy for the battles ahead. As he made his way toward the stables, he was surprised to encounter Jenkins in one of the side corridors, apparently waiting for him with barely concealed urgency. "Your Grace," the butler said in a low voice, glancing nervously around to ensure they were alone. "Might I request a private word?" Charles nodded, following Jenkins into a small alcove beneath one of the palace's grand staircases. The space was rarely used except for storage, ensuring their conversation would remain unheard by curious ears. Jenkins's usually perfect composure showed visible cracks, his hands trembling slightly as he smoothed his already immaculate jacket. "I hope you'll forgive my presumption, Your Grace," Jenkins began, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I feel compelled to share certain information that may be relevant to your current situation." "Please speak freely, Jenkins," Charles replied, sensing the gravity of whatever the butler was about to reveal. "It concerns the Duchess's plans for Lady Catherine," Jenkins continued, his eyes darting nervously toward the main corridor. "I'm afraid Her Grace has been quite busy this morning, despite the early hour. She's sent urgent messages to Lord Melbourne, Lady Catherine's father, requesting an immediate conference regarding his daughter's future. She's also contacted Lady Worthington, who, as you know, controls the guest list for most of London's important social events." Charles felt his blood turn to ice. Lady Worthington was the unofficial gatekeeper of high society, a woman whose approval or disapproval could make or break a person's social standing. If Camilla had poisoned that well, Catherine would find herself ostracized from every drawing room and ballroom in England. "There's more, I'm afraid," Jenkins continued, his distress evident despite his professional training. The Duchess has also written to several prominent charitable organizations, including the Royal Children's Hospital Foundation, where Lady Catherine serves on the board. I believe she intends to question Lady Catherine's suitability for such positions. The scope of Camilla's campaign took Charles's breath away. His stepmother wasn't simply trying to remove Catherine from his life. She was systematically destroying every aspect of Catherine's social and professional existence. It was character assassination on a grand scale, conducted with the ruthless efficiency of a military operation. "How do you know all this?" Charles asked, though he immediately regretted the question. Jenkins had risked his position by sharing this information, and questioning his sources only made the butler's situation more precarious. The Duchess requires considerable secretarial assistance for such extensive correspondence, Jenkins replied diplomatically. "And the staff?" "Well, Your Grace, the staff talks among themselves. We're all quite fond of Lady Catherine, and we're concerned about the injustice of the situation." The revelation that the palace servants were rallying to Catherine's defense provided Charles with his first glimmer of hope since the previous evening's confrontation. If the household staff supported Catherine, it meant her character and kindness had made a genuine impression on people who were excellent judges of human nature. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention," Charles said, clasping the butler's shoulder briefly. "Your loyalty to this family, and to what's right, will not be forgotten." Jenkins bowed slightly, relief evident in his features. "If I may, Your Grace, Lady Catherine refused breakfast again this morning, but she did accept some tea and toast. Mrs. Whitmore is concerned about her health, but more than that, she's worried about the lady's spirits. We all are." The image of Catherine alone in her chambers, too proud or too hurt to ask for help, strengthened Charles's resolve. He had spent his entire life being groomed to make difficult decisions and shoulder heavy responsibilities. This was perhaps the most important choice he would ever face, and he refused to let fear or tradition prevent him from doing what was right. After dismissing Jenkins with renewed thanks, Charles abandoned his plans for a morning ride and instead made his way to the palace's extensive library. The two-story room, with its soaring ceilings and walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes, had always been his refuge during times of stress or uncertainty. Today, however, he wasn't seeking comfort among the classics of literature and philosophy. He needed information, and he suspected he might find it in his father's private papers. Edmund Ashworth had been meticulous about record-keeping, maintaining detailed files on family finances, estate management, and social obligations. Charles had inherited access to these papers upon his father's death, but he had never felt the need to examine them thoroughly. Now, however, he suspected they might contain information about Camilla that could prove useful in the current crisis. The filing cabinets containing Edmund's personal correspondence were located in a small study adjoining the main library. Charles spent nearly 2 hours sorting through folders of business letters, family communications, and social invitations before he found what he was looking for, a thick folder labeled Personal and Confidential in his father's distinctive handwriting. Inside, he discovered a collection of documents that painted a very different picture of Camilla's marriage to his father than the one he had always believed. There were letters from Edmund's solicitors expressing concern about the financial arrangements of the marriage, warning that Camilla's debts from her first marriage were more extensive than initially disclosed. There were also private investigator reports detailing Camilla's social activities during her first marriage, including allegations of affairs with prominent married men and questionable financial dealings with several London merchants. Most shocking of all was a letter Edmund had apparently never sent, dated just 6 months before his death. In it, addressed to his solicitor but marked Draft, Do Not Send, Edmund expressed regret about his hasty second marriage and concern about Camilla's influence over the household staff and estate management. The letter suggested that Edmund had begun to see through Camilla's carefully constructed facade, but had died before taking any action to address his concerns. Charles sat back in his father's leather chair, the weight of these revelations settling over him like a heavy blanket. His father hadn't been the willing participant in a strategic marriage that Camilla had portrayed. He had been deceived by a woman who was far more calculating and manipulative than anyone had realized. The knowledge was both liberating and deeply disturbing, freeing Charles from some of his guilt about challenging family tradition while revealing the extent of Camilla's capacity for deception. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his reading. Charles quickly gathered the papers and locked them back in the filing cabinet before calling for the visitor to enter. To his surprise, Lady Margaret Thornfield, his father's elderly sister, stepped into the room with the aid of her ornate walking stick. At 78, Lady Margaret remained a formidable presence despite her advancing years. Her silver hair was styled in an elegant chignon, and her deep purple morning dress was perfectly tailored to her still erect figure. More importantly, she possessed one of the sharpest minds in the family and a network of connections that rivaled Camilla's own influence in society. "Charles, my dear boy," she said, settling herself in the chair across from the desk with practiced grace. "I hope you don't mind my intruding, but I felt we needed to talk." "Of course, Aunt Margaret," Charles replied, rising to greet her properly. "You're always welcome here. I've just come from the morning room, where I had a most illuminating conversation with our dear Camilla," Lady Margaret continued, her tone suggesting the conversation had been anything but pleasant. "She seemed quite concerned about your recent behavior and asked for my assistance in helping you see reason regarding a certain young lady." Charles felt his defenses rise immediately, but Lady Margaret raised a jeweled hand to forestall his response. "Before you prepare to defend Lady Catherine," she said with a slight smile, "let me assure you that Camilla's request fell upon deaf ears. I've had the pleasure of observing Lady Catherine during her stays here, and I find her to be a remarkable young woman of exceptional character and intelligence." The relief that washed over Charles was so intense he had to grip the edge of the desk to steady himself. Lady Margaret's support would carry enormous weight in any family discussions about Catherine's suitability, and her social connections could help counter Camilla's campaign of character assassination. "I was hoping you might feel that way," Charles admitted. "Camilla seems determined to drive Catherine away, regardless of my feelings in the matter." Lady Margaret's expression darkened slightly. "Yes, I gathered as much from our conversation. Camilla was quite explicit about her intentions, though she couched them in terms of family duty and social responsibility. I found her arguments unconvincing and her methods rather distasteful." The elderly woman leaned forward slightly, her intelligent eyes studying Charles with the intensity she had once brought to bear on recalcitrant diplomats during her years as an ambassador's wife. "Charles, I'm going to share something with you that I probably should have mentioned years ago," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. "Your father came to me about 6 months before his death, expressing concerns about Camilla's true character and motivations. He had begun to suspect that his second marriage was not the partnership he had hoped for, and he was considering taking steps to limit Camilla's influence over family affairs." The revelation confirmed what Charles had just discovered in his father's papers, but hearing it from Lady Margaret made it feel more real and immediate. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Charles asked. "Because your father died before he could act on his concerns, and I saw no point in causing family discord when there was nothing to be gained," Lady Margaret replied. "But the current situation changes everything. If Camilla is willing to destroy an innocent young woman to maintain her position, then it's time for the family to take a stand." Lady Margaret rose from her chair and moved to the window, where pale autumn sunlight was beginning to pierce the morning fog. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who had weathered decades of social and political storms with her dignity intact. "I've spent my entire life navigating the complexities of aristocratic society," she continued, "and I can tell you with absolute certainty that the quality of a person's character matters far more than the accident of their birth. Lady Catherine possesses virtues that many of our so-called noble friends lack entirely." Charles joined her at the window, feeling a sense of kinship with this remarkable woman who had always been more of a mother figure to him than Camilla ever was. "What would you suggest I do?" he asked. "Camilla has made it clear that she'll stop at nothing to remove Catherine from my life, and she has considerable resources at her disposal." Lady Margaret's smile was sharp and calculating, revealing a strategic mind that had been shaped by decades of high-stakes social maneuvering. "What I suggest, my dear nephew, is that we fight fire with fire," she said. "Camilla may have her connections, but I have mine as well. And, more importantly, I have something she lacks: the moral authority that comes from being genuinely concerned with what's right rather than what's expedient." She turned to face Charles directly, her expression growing serious once again. "There will be risks involved, Charles. If we challenge Camilla directly, she'll escalate her attacks on both you and Lady Catherine. Are you prepared for that level of conflict within your own family?" Charles thought of Catherine alone in her chambers, probably composing letters of resignation to the charitable organizations she loved, preparing to retreat from a world that had shown her such cruelty. He thought of the servants' concern for her welfare, of Jenkins's courage in bringing him information at considerable personal risk, of Lady Margaret's willingness to stand up for what was right despite the potential family consequences. "Yes," he said firmly. "I'm prepared for whatever comes." Lady Margaret nodded approvingly. "Then, we begin immediately. I'll start making calls to counter whatever poison Camilla has been spreading about Lady Catherine. You should go to her and explain the situation honestly. She deserves to know what she's facing and to have the choice of whether to fight or retreat. And if she chooses to fight." Lady Margaret's smile was fierce with anticipation. "Then, Camilla will discover that she's not the only one in this family who knows how to conduct a campaign of social warfare." As Charles made his way through the palace corridors toward Catherine's chambers, he felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in his life, he was actively challenging the authority figures who had shaped his world, choosing his own path rather than following the one laid out for him by tradition and expectation. The walk to Catherine's suite took him through some of the palace's most beautiful spaces, past portraits of ancestors who had made their own difficult choices in different times and circumstances. He wondered what they would think of his decision to defy convention for love, whether they would see it as a betrayal of family honor or as the truest expression of noble character. When he reached Catherine's door, he paused for a moment, gathering his courage for what might be the most important conversation of his life. Everything would change after this moment, one way or another. There would be no going back to the safe, predictable world he had known. He knocked softly on the polished wood, his heart racing as he waited for Catherine's response. Whatever happened next, he was committed to seeing it through to the end. That Catherine's voice, when it came through the heavy oak door, was barely audible and carried none of its usual warmth and confidence. "Please, not now. I'm not feeling well." Charles pressed his palm against the cool wood, wishing he could reach through it to offer comfort. "Catherine, it's Charles. We need to talk." A long silence followed, during which Charles could hear the faint sound of movement within the room. Finally, the door opened just wide enough for Catherine to peer out, and Charles felt his heart break at the sight of her. Her usually luminous emerald eyes were red-rimmed from crying. Her auburn hair hung loose and uncombed around her shoulders, and she wore a simple day dress that looked as though she had slept in it. Most tellingly, the confident posture that had always defined her presence was gone, replaced by the hunched shoulders of someone trying to make herself as small as possible. "Charles, please," she whispered, glancing nervously down the corridor. "If your stepmother sees you here." "I don't care what Camilla sees or thinks," Charles replied firmly, though he kept his voice low to avoid attracting unwanted attention. "May I come in? What I have to say is important, and these corridors have too many ears." Catherine hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between her desire to avoid further conflict and her need to understand what was happening to her world. Finally, she stepped back to allow him entry, closing the door quietly behind him and turning the key in the lock with shaking fingers. The guest suite that had been Catherine's home during her visits to Windermere was elegant, but not ostentatious, decorated in soft creams and pale golds that complemented her coloring beautifully. Normally, the room reflected Catherine's organized nature and refined taste, but today it bore signs of distress. Papers were scattered across the writing desk, several letters appeared to have been started and abandoned, and a breakfast tray sat untouched on the side table. Catherine moved to the window seat where she had obviously been sitting, drawing her knees up to her chest in a defensive posture that made her look far younger than her 28 years. The morning light streaming through the glass revealed the extent of her exhaustion and emotional turmoil. "I've been writing letters," she said quietly, gesturing toward the desk. "Resignations, mostly. To the hospital board, the children's charity, the Literacy Foundation. I thought it would be easier for everyone if I simply withdrew from all my commitments and returned to London permanently." The defeated tone in her voice ignited a fierce protective anger in Charles that surprised him with its intensity. This vibrant, passionate woman who had brought so much light into his world was preparing to retreat into the shadows, and he refused to let Camilla's cruelty achieve such a devastating victory. "Catherine, look at me," he said gently, moving closer but respecting the distance she seemed to need. "You're not going anywhere, and you're certainly not resigning from work that means so much to you and to the people you help." Catherine's laugh was bitter and entirely unlike her usual musical laughter. "Charles, please don't make this harder than it already is. Yesterday made everything crystal clear. I don't belong in your world, and I was foolish to ever think I could." Yesterday was a performance orchestrated by someone who feels threatened by everything you represent, Charles countered, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. Camilla's attack on you had nothing to do with your worthiness, and everything to do with her own insecurities and ambitions. Catherine turned to look at him fully for the first time since he had entered the room, and Charles could see a flicker of her old spirit in her eyes, though it was nearly overwhelmed by pain and doubt. Her words weren't wrong, though, were they? Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. I am from a more modest background. I don't have generations of noble blood or an understanding of aristocratic traditions that comes from birth. Maybe I was reaching too far above my station. Charles felt something inside him shift and crystallize, a transformation from the uncertain heir who had always deferred to family expectations into a man who knew exactly what he valued and what he was willing to fight for. He moved to sit on the edge of the bed, close enough to reach Catherine but still respecting her need for space. Catherine, I need to tell you something that I should have said months ago, he began, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. I love you, not despite your background or in spite of your origins, but because of who you are as a person. Your compassion, your intelligence, your dedication to helping others. These are the qualities that make you extraordinary, not the circumstances of your birth. Catherine's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she shook her head slowly. Love isn't enough, Charles. You know that as well as I do. You have responsibilities, obligations to your family, and your heritage that I can't ask you to abandon. What if I told you that abandoning those responsibilities might actually be the most honorable thing I could do? Charles asked. What if I told you that the version of family duty Camilla has been preaching isn't actually what my father believed or what our family traditions truly represent? He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew some of the documents he had found in his father's papers, including the draft letter expressing Edmund's regrets about his second marriage. Catherine accepted the papers with trembling hands, her expression growing more shocked as she read. Your father wrote this? She asked, looking up from the pages with wide eyes. 6 months before he died, Charles confirmed. He had begun to see through Camilla's facade, and he was planning to take steps to limit her influence over family affairs. He died before he could act on those concerns, but his true feelings are clear. Catherine set the papers aside and wrapped her arms around her knees again, her expression thoughtful as she processed this new information. Even if this changes how I feel about your stepmother, she said slowly, it doesn't change the fundamental reality of our situation. I'm still not the kind of woman who traditionally marries into families like yours. Traditionally, no, Charles agreed. But traditions evolve, Catherine. They have to, or they become empty rituals that serve no purpose beyond maintaining the status quo. What matters is not whether you fit the traditional mold, but whether you embody the values that make that mold worth preserving. He moved closer, encouraged when Catherine didn't retreat further into the window seat. You care about serving others, he continued. You're dedicated to making a positive difference in the world. You treat everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their station. These are the qualities that true nobility represents, not bloodlines or ancient titles. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the estate grounds where morning mist still clung to the distant trees. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. What are you saying, Charles? That we should ignore the opposition and the social consequences and simply follow our hearts? I'm saying that we should stand up for what we believe is right, Charles replied. I'm saying that I refuse to let fear or tradition prevent me from choosing a future with the woman I love. But I'm also saying that if we do this, we do it together, with full knowledge of what we're facing. He reached for her hands, relieved when she didn't pull away from his touch. Camilla has been conducting a campaign to destroy your reputation and drive you away from me, he said gently. She's contacted your father, the social gatekeepers in London, and the charitable organizations where you serve. She's not going to stop until she gets what she wants. Catherine's face paled at this revelation, but Charles saw something else in her expression as well, a spark of anger that reminded him of the strong, determined woman he had fallen in love with. She's trying to destroy my charitable work? Catherine asked, her voice hardening. The Children's Hospital Project, the Literacy Foundation? All of it, Charles confirmed. But you have allies as well. Lady Margaret has offered her support, and the palace staff are firmly on your side. Jenkins risked his position to warn me about Camilla's plans. Catherine stood suddenly, pacing to the fireplace where she stood with her back to Charles for several minutes. When she turned around, Her posture had straightened, and her eyes held a determination that had been absent since the previous day's humiliation. "Those charities serve thousands of people," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The Children's Hospital Wing will provide medical care for families who can't afford private treatment. The literacy program teaches reading skills to working-class adults who never had educational opportunities. If Camilla thinks she can destroy those programs just to serve her own political purposes, she's going to discover that I'm not as easy to intimidate as she believes." Charles felt his heart soar at the return of Catherine's fighting spirit. This was the woman who had organized international fundraising campaigns, who had personally delivered supplies to orphanages in London's worst neighborhoods, who had never backed down from a challenge when the welfare of others was at stake. "Does this mean you'll fight?" he asked, rising from the bed to face her. Catherine moved to the writing desk where her resignation letters lay scattered and, with deliberate ceremony, began tearing them into small pieces. "It means I'm not running away," she said firmly. "I may not have been born into nobility, but I was raised to stand up for what's right. If your stepmother wants a war, she'll get one." Charles crossed the room and gathered Catherine into his arms, feeling her tension and fear gradually give way to determined resolve. For the first time since the previous evening's confrontation, he felt genuine hope that they might find a way through the storm ahead. "There's something else," he said, pulling back to look into her eyes. "Lady Margaret is organizing support among the family and their social connections. She believes we can counter Camilla's influence, but it will require a coordinated effort." Catherine nodded thoughtfully. "What about your position as heir? If this becomes a public scandal, could it affect your eventual inheritance or your role in the family?" It was a question Charles had been avoiding, but he knew he had to face it honestly. The laws governing noble succession were complex, and while his position as heir was legally secure, social disgrace could make his eventual role as duke far more difficult to fulfill effectively. "There are risks," he admitted, "but they're risks I'm willing to take. Catherine, I've spent my entire life preparing to inherit a title and estates, but if that inheritance requires me to abandon the woman I love and compromise my personal values, then perhaps it's not worth having." Catherine studied his face carefully, as if looking for any sign of doubt or reservation. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly and straightened her shoulders with renewed purpose. "Then, we need a strategy," she said, moving to the desk and clearing away the torn resignation letters. "If we're going to challenge someone with Camilla's resources and connections, we need to be smart about it." Charles watched admiringly as Catherine's organizational skills reasserted themselves. Within minutes, she had found fresh paper and was making notes, her mind already working on the tactical aspects of the battle ahead. "First, we need to understand exactly what damage has already been done," she said, writing quickly. "I should contact my father directly and find out what Camilla has told him. We also need to know which social figures and charitable organizations have been contacted and what specific allegations have been made." "Lady Margaret is already working on that," Charles said. "She has contacts throughout London society who can provide intelligence about what rumors are circulating." "Good. Second, we need to go on the offensive rather than simply responding to attacks. I have 2 years of documentation about my charitable work, including financial records and letters of recommendation from the people we've helped. If Camilla wants to question my character, she'll have to explain why dozens of orphans, hospital patients, and literacy students are wrong about my dedication to their causes." Charles felt a surge of pride at Catherine's tactical thinking. She wasn't just preparing to defend herself. She was planning a campaign that would highlight the positive impact of her work while exposing the petty motivations behind Camilla's attacks. "Third," Catherine continued, "we need to control the narrative. If this becomes public, and it probably will, we want to make sure people understand that this is about more than just a personal relationship. It's about what kind of values the aristocracy represents, and whether noble families can evolve to meet the challenges of the modern world." "And fourth?" Charles asked, impressed by the comprehensive nature of her planning. Catherine's smile, when it came, was fierce and beautiful and entirely like her old self. "Fourth, we make sure that whatever happens, we face it together. No more secrets, no more trying to protect each other by keeping information hidden. If we're going to win this, we need complete honesty and trust between us." Charles took her hands in his, feeling the calluses she had earned from years of hands-on charitable work, marks that told the story of her character far better than any genealogy ever could. "Complete honesty and trust," he agreed. "Starting with this. I love you, Catherine Melbourne, and I want to spend my life with you regardless of what obstacles we face. Catherine's response was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door, followed immediately by Camilla's imperious voice. Lady Catherine, I know Lord Charles is in there with you. This inappropriate behavior stops now. Catherine and Charles exchanged a look of grim determination. The real battle was about to begin, but they would face it together, and they would not back down. Camilla's voice carried through the heavy door with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience, but Charles felt no urge to comply with her demands. Instead, he squeezed Catherine's hand reassuringly and moved toward the door with deliberate calm. One moment, please, he called out, his tone politely formal, but carrying an undertone of steel that would have surprised anyone who knew him only as the dutiful heir. Catherine straightened her appearance quickly, smoothing her hair and adjusting her dress with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to present herself properly under pressure. Despite her recent distress, she managed to compose her features into an expression of dignified courtesy that revealed nothing of the strategic planning that had just taken place. Charles unlocked the door and opened it to find Camilla flanked by 2 footmen, a tactical choice that was clearly designed to emphasize her authority and create witnesses to whatever confrontation was about to unfold. The Duchess was immaculately dressed in a severe black morning gown that made her look like an avenging angel, her platinum hair styled in a tight chignon that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. Duchess, Charles said with a slight bow that managed to be technically correct while conveying minimal respect. To what do we owe this unexpected visit? Camilla's blue eyes flashed with anger at his deliberately neutral tone, but she maintained her icy composure as she looked past him toward Catherine, who had moved to stand beside the fireplace with her chin raised defiantly. I think we can dispense with pretense, Charles, Camilla said coldly. The entire household is talking about your inappropriate presence in Lady Catherine's private chambers. Such behavior is scandalous and reflects poorly on the dignity of this family. What's scandalous? Catherine interjected, her voice carrying a quiet strength that made Charles's heart swell with pride. Is the systematic campaign of character assassination that you've been conducting against me. Did you really think I wouldn't discover your communications with my father and the charitable organizations I serve? Camilla's perfectly controlled expression flickered for just a moment, revealing surprise that Catherine knew about her activities. The Duchess had clearly expected to face a broken, defeated woman, not someone prepared to fight back with detailed knowledge of her tactics. I have no idea what you're referring to, Camilla replied smoothly, though Charles could see the calculation behind her eyes as she reassessed the situation. I've simply been ensuring that relevant parties understand the true nature of your relationship with my stepson and its implications for this family. The true nature? Charles stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Catherine in a gesture that was both protective and symbolic. And what exactly have you told these relevant parties about the true nature of our relationship? Camilla smiled with cold satisfaction, clearly pleased to have drawn Charles into the confrontation on her terms. I've told them that you've become infatuated with a woman whose background makes her entirely unsuitable for the position she appears to be seeking, Camilla said bluntly. I've explained that Lady Catherine has been encouraging your attachment in the hope of securing a marriage that would elevate her far beyond her natural station. The accusation hung in the air like a poisonous cloud, designed to portray Catherine as a manipulative social climber and Charles as a naive fool. It was exactly the kind of narrative that would resonate with the more traditional elements of aristocratic society, people who saw any challenge to established hierarchy as a threat to their own positions. Catherine's face had gone pale at the brutal directness of the attack, but her voice remained steady when she responded. And what evidence did you provide for these allegations about my character and motivations? She asked. Evidence. Camilla's laugh was sharp and dismissive. My dear girl, in our circles, the word of a duchess carries considerably more weight than the protestations of innocence from someone in your position. I hardly need to provide evidence when my assessment of the situation is based on 40 years of experience in these matters. Charles felt a surge of pure rage at Camilla's casual arrogance, but he forced himself to remain calm. Losing his temper would only play into her hands and provide her with ammunition about his unsuitability for leadership. Your experience, Charles said carefully, appears to have led you to some unfortunate conclusions. Perhaps it's time you learned some facts that might change your perspective. He reached into his jacket and withdrew the documents he had discovered in his father's papers, including the draft letter expressing Edmund's doubts about his second marriage. Camilla's eyes widened slightly as she recognized her late husband's handwriting, and, for the first time since the confrontation began, she looked genuinely uncertain. "What is this?" she demanded, though her voice lacked its previous confident authority. "Letters from my father," Charles replied, handing the papers to her with deliberate ceremony, "including his private thoughts about your marriage and his concerns about your true character." It seems he had quite a different perspective on matters of suitability and appropriate behavior. Camilla's face went through a series of expressions as she read, from confusion to shock to barely controlled fury. The draft letter was particularly damaging because it revealed not only Edmund's doubts about Camilla but also his growing awareness of her manipulative nature and questionable financial dealings. "These are private papers," Camilla said finally, her voice shaking slightly. "You had no right to go through your father's personal correspondence." "I had every right as his heir and the current head of this family," Charles replied firmly. "And what I discovered suggests that your claims about understanding family honor and appropriate behavior might be somewhat hypocritical." The footman who had accompanied Camilla shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that they were witnessing a family crisis that was rapidly escalating beyond their comfort level. Charles noticed their discomfort and decided to use it to his advantage. "You may go," he told them directly, exercising the authority that would eventually be his by right. "This is a private family matter that doesn't require witnesses." The footman looked to Camilla for confirmation, but when she failed to countermand Charles's order, they withdrew with obvious relief. The removal of her audience seemed to deflate some of Camilla's theatrical authority, leaving her to face Charles and Catherine with only her own resources. "You think you're very clever, don't you?" Camilla said, her mask of dignified composure finally, slipping to reveal the calculating fury beneath. "You think those papers change anything? Your father is dead, Charles. Whatever doubts he may have had about our marriage died with him, and I am still the Duchess of Windermere with all the rights and privileges that title entails." "Rights and privileges that don't include destroying innocent people to serve your own ambitions," Catherine said, stepping forward to stand beside Charles in a show of unified resistance. "I've spent the morning documenting everything I know about your campaign against me, including the specific lies you've told and the people you've contacted. If you continue this behavior, I'll have no choice but to take legal action for defamation of character." Camilla's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Legal action? You foolish girl, you have no idea what you're threatening. If you attempt to drag this family into a public scandal, I'll ensure that you're not only ostracized from respectable society, but that every charitable organization in England understands exactly what kind of person they've been dealing with." "And what kind of person is that?" Charles demanded. "The kind," Camilla replied with vicious satisfaction, "who seduces a future duke in the hope of securing a position she could never achieve through her own merits. The kind who manipulates charitable organizations to gain social access and credibility. The kind who destroys families and traditions for personal gain." The accusations were devastating in their scope and creativity, designed to transform Catherine's greatest strengths into evidence of manipulation and deceit. Charles realized that this was exactly the narrative Camilla had been spreading through her network of contacts, painting Catherine as a master manipulator rather than the genuinely caring person she actually was. But Catherine surprised both Charles and Camilla with her response. Instead of becoming defensive or emotional, she smiled with what could only be described as anticipatory pleasure. "That's an interesting theory," Catherine said calmly. "I assume you have evidence to support these claims about my character and motivations?" "I hardly need evidence when the pattern of behavior is so obvious," Camilla replied, though she sounded less certain than before. "Actually, you do need evidence if you're going to continue making these allegations publicly," Catherine said, producing a folder from the desk behind her. "Because I have 2 years of documentation proving the exact opposite of everything you've claimed." She opened the folder to reveal letters, financial records, and photographs documenting her charitable work in extraordinary detail. There were thank you notes from families whose children had received medical care through the hospital program, financial audits showing that every penny of donated money had been properly allocated, and photographs of Catherine working directly with the people she served. "This is a letter from the Archbishop of Canterbury commending my work with homeless children," Catherine continued, reading from the papers. "This is a financial audit showing that the literacy program I organized has achieved a 97% success rate while operating under budget. And These are testimonials from 43 families whose lives have been directly improved by the charitable programs I've initiated. Charles watched with growing amazement as Catherine systematically dismantled every element of Camilla's character assassination. She hadn't just been crying in her room. She had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation with the thoroughness of a general planning a military campaign. None of that changes the fundamental unsuitability of your background, Camilla said, but her voice lacked conviction and her earlier confidence had evaporated completely. You're right, Catherine agreed. I wasn't born into nobility, but I was raised with values that I believe are more important than bloodlines: integrity, compassion, and a genuine desire to serve others. If those qualities make me unsuitable for your family, then perhaps this family isn't as honorable as it claims to be. The challenge was delivered with such quiet dignity that even Camilla seemed momentarily speechless. Charles felt a surge of love and admiration for Catherine's courage in facing down someone with so much more social power and influence. Furthermore, Catherine continued, I think the people of England deserve to know what kind of values are really being represented by their noble families. If you force this into a public forum, I'll be happy to let them compare your version of aristocratic behavior with the actual evidence of how I've chosen to live my life. Camilla had gone very still, her face pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. For the first time since Charles had known her, she seemed genuinely uncertain about her next move. This conversation is not over, she said finally, but the threat sounded hollow compared to her earlier imperious demands. No, it's not, Charles agreed. But the next time we discuss this matter, it will be in the presence of Lady Margaret and the family solicitors. I think it's time we had a formal review of family policies and priorities. Camilla's departure was less dramatic than her arrival, but far more ominous in its implications. As the door closed behind her, Charles and Catherine looked at each other with the sobering realization that they had just crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. She'll escalate now, Catherine said quietly. This was just the opening move. Let her, Charles replied, pulling Catherine into his arms. We're ready for whatever comes next. But even as he spoke the words, Charles wondered if anyone could truly be ready for the kind of warfare that Camilla was capable of waging. The real battle was just beginning, and the stakes couldn't be higher. 3 days after the confrontation in Catherine's chambers, Windermere Palace had transformed into a battleground where every conversation carried hidden meaning and every alliance could shift without warning. Charles spent his morning in urgent consultation with Lady Margaret and the family solicitors, while Catherine worked tirelessly to document every aspect of Camilla's campaign of destruction. The atmosphere throughout the palace was tense with anticipation, as staff and family members alike sensed that momentous changes were approaching. The crisis reached its climax on Thursday evening during what was supposed to be a routine family dinner. Lady Margaret had insisted that all parties gather in the formal dining room to address the situation openly, rather than allowing the conflict to continue festering in whispered conversations and secret meetings. The massive mahogany table, which had hosted kings and prime ministers throughout its history, now served as the venue for a confrontation that would determine the future of the Ashworth family. Charles arrived first, dressed in formal evening wear that emphasized both his aristocratic bearing and his newfound determination to chart his own course. He had spent the afternoon reviewing additional documents from his father's papers, including financial records that revealed the true extent of Camilla's debts and questionable business dealings. The knowledge weighed heavily on him, but it also strengthened his resolve to protect Catherine from further attacks. Catherine entered the dining room shortly after Charles, and he felt his breath catch at the sight of her. She wore an elegant navy blue gown that brought out the color of her eyes, and her auburn hair was styled in a sophisticated arrangement that emphasized her graceful neck and shoulders. More importantly, she carried herself with a confidence and dignity that spoke of inner strength rather than aristocratic breeding. She was beautiful, but it was her character that made her truly radiant. Lady Margaret followed Catherine into the room, resplendent in deep purple silk that complemented her silver hair. At 78, she remained a formidable presence, her intelligent eyes missing nothing as she assessed the mood and positioning of everyone present. Her afternoon had been spent making strategic phone calls to key figures in London society, and Charles could see from her satisfied expression that those conversations had gone well. Camilla was the last to arrive, and her entrance was carefully calculated for maximum dramatic impact. She wore a striking black gown with emerald jewelry that emphasized her status as the reigning duchess, and her platinum hair was arranged in an elaborate style that recalled the formal portraits of previous generations. But Charles noticed that beneath the carefully maintained facade, there were signs of strain. Her smile seemed forced, and her usually perfect posture showed subtle signs of tension. "Well," Camilla said as she took her seat at the head of the table, "I assume we're all here to discuss the recent unpleasantness. I hope we can resolve this matter quickly and with minimal drama." Lady Margaret's laugh was dry and completely lacking in humor. "I'm afraid that ship has already sailed, my dear Camilla. The drama, as you put it, began when you decided to wage war against an innocent young woman whose only crime was winning my nephew's heart." "Innocent?" Camilla's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her composed demeanor. "Margaret, surely you can't be serious. This woman has been systematically pursuing Charles with the obvious intention of securing a marriage that would elevate her far beyond her natural station." "Actually," Catherine interjected quietly, "I think it's time everyone heard the truth about our relationship and my intentions." She reached into her evening bag and withdrew a small velvet box, placing it on the table in front of her with deliberate ceremony. The gesture drew everyone's attention, and Charles felt his heart begin to race as he recognized the distinctive shape of a ring box. "3 months ago," Catherine continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing, "Charles proposed marriage to me. I accepted, though we agreed to keep our engagement private until we could find the right way to share the news with his family." The silence that followed her announcement was deafening. Camilla's face had gone completely white, while Lady Margaret looked pleased but not particularly surprised. Charles reached for Catherine's hand across the table, grateful that their secret was finally out in the open. "You're engaged?" Camilla whispered, her voice barely audible. "We are," Charles confirmed, his voice carrying a strength and conviction that surprised even him. "And before you launch into another lecture about duty and tradition, you should know that I've given this decision considerable thought. Catherine is the woman I want to spend my life with, regardless of the social complications that might arise." Camilla seemed to shake herself out of her initial shock, her political instincts reasserting themselves as she searched for a way to regain control of the situation. "This is impossible," she declared, her voice regaining its earlier authority. "Charles, you cannot seriously be considering marriage to someone of such inappropriate background. The scandal alone would destroy this family's reputation and your own prospects for effective leadership." "Speaking of scandals," Lady Margaret interjected smoothly, "perhaps we should discuss the one that's been brewing right here under our own roof." She reached into her own evening bag and withdrew a thick folder of papers, spreading them across the table with practiced efficiency. Charles recognized some of the documents as copies of the materials he had discovered in his father's private papers, but there were others he had never seen before. "These," Lady Margaret announced, "are financial records, private investigator reports, and correspondence that paint a very interesting picture of Camilla's activities both during and after her marriage to Edmund." Camilla's face had gone from white to ashen gray, and Charles could see her hands trembling as she stared at the papers spread before them. "Margaret, those are private documents," she said, but her voice lacked any real authority. "Private documents that reveal a pattern of deception, financial manipulation, and social climbing that makes your accusations against Catherine seem rather ironic," Lady Margaret replied calmly. "Did you really think no one would ever discover your gambling debts? Your affairs with married men during your first marriage? The bribes you paid to secure invitations to important social events? The revelations hit like physical blows, each one destroying another piece of Camilla's carefully constructed image." Charles stared at his stepmother with a mixture of shock and disgust, realizing that the woman who had lectured him about family honor and appropriate behavior had been living a lie for decades. "Those allegations are completely false," Camilla protested, but her voice was shaking and her usual confidence had completely evaporated. "Are they?" Catherine asked, her voice gentle but implacable. "Because I've spent the past 3 days conducting my own investigation into your background, and what I've discovered is quite illuminating." She produced her own folder of documents, adding them to the growing pile on the table. "These are court records from your divorce proceedings with your first husband," Catherine continued. "They detail allegations of adultery, financial misconduct, and fraud. These are statements from several London merchants describing your failure to pay debts totaling nearly £50,000. And These are private investigator reports commissioned by families whose daughters were rejected by potential suitors after you spread rumors about their character. The scope of Camilla's deception was breathtaking, revealing a woman who had built her entire social position on lies, manipulation, and the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened her ambitions. Charles felt sick as he realized how completely she had fooled his father and, for many years, himself. Even if those allegations were true, Camilla said desperately, it doesn't change the fundamental unsuitability of this proposed marriage. Charles, you're the heir to one of England's oldest dukedoms. You cannot throw away centuries of tradition for an infatuation with a commoner. Tradition? Charles stood up suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that echoed through the formal dining room. You want to talk about tradition, Camilla? Let me tell you what I've learned about Ashworth family traditions. He moved to the portrait gallery that lined one wall of the dining room, stopping in front of a painting of his great-great-grandfather, the 5th Duke of Windermere. This man married the daughter of a Scottish blacksmith because he fell in love with her character and her intelligence, Charles said, his voice carrying throughout the room. This woman, he continued, moving to another portrait, was the daughter of a French refugee who arrived in England with nothing but the clothes on her back. She became one of the most respected hostesses in London society. He turned to face the table, his eyes blazing with conviction. The real Ashworth tradition isn't about maintaining artificial barriers or protecting privilege, he declared. It's about service, honor, and recognizing true worth when we encounter it. Catherine embodies those values more completely than anyone I've ever met, including most of the so-called nobles in our social circle. Camilla made one last desperate attempt to regain control of the situation, rising from her chair with theatrical dignity. Charles, if you go through with this marriage, you'll be ostracized from respectable society, she warned. The best families will close their doors to you, and your ability to serve effectively as Duke will be severely compromised. Actually, Lady Margaret interjected with evident satisfaction, I think you'll find that respectable society has a very different opinion of this matter than you might expect. She reached for her evening bag once again and withdrew a stack of letters and telegrams, spreading them across the table beside the other documents. These are responses to inquiries I made yesterday about Catherine's reputation and the circumstances of your campaign against her, Lady Margaret explained. The Archbishop of Canterbury describes her as a young woman of exceptional character whose charitable work exemplifies Christian virtue. The Prime Minister's wife calls her an inspiring example of modern nobility. And the Queen Mother herself has written to express her admiration for Catherine's dedication to helping disadvantaged children. Charles felt a surge of joy and vindication as he realized the extent of support Catherine had earned through her own merit. The most respected figures in British society were rallying to her defense, not because of her birth or connections, but because of her demonstrated character and achievements. Furthermore, Lady Margaret continued, I've received assurances from no fewer than 12 ducal families that they would be honored to welcome Catherine into their circles as Charles's wife. It seems that your version of respectable society is considerably smaller and less influential than you imagined. Camilla sank back into her chair, the weight of her defeat evident in every line of her body. Her carefully constructed world was crumbling around her, and she seemed to realize that further resistance would only make her situation worse. There's one more thing, Catherine said gently, her voice carrying no trace of triumph or vindictiveness. I want everyone to understand that I'm not trying to change or abandon the traditions of this family. I'm hoping to contribute to them in my own way, to help bridge the gap between aristocratic responsibility and modern social needs. She opened the ring box she had placed on the table earlier, revealing an exquisite sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the candlelight with brilliant fire. This was Charles's great-grandmother's engagement ring, she explained. He chose it because he said it represented the best of family tradition combined with the promise of something new. I've accepted it not as a symbol of social climbing, but as a commitment to serve this family and the people it represents with the same dedication I've brought to my charitable work. Charles moved to stand beside Catherine's chair, placing his hand on her shoulder in a gesture of support and unity. I love Catherine Melbourne, he said, his voice carrying throughout the room with absolute conviction. I love her character, her intelligence, her compassion, and her strength. I'm proud to call her my fiancée, and I will be honored to call her my wife. Anyone who cannot accept that reality is welcome to reconsider their relationship with this family. Lady Margaret applauded softly, her eyes bright with approval and affection. "Beautifully said, my dear nephew," she declared. "Edmund would be very proud of the man you've become and the choice you've made." Camilla remained silent for several long minutes, staring at the evidence of her deception spread across the table. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible and completely stripped of its earlier authority. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Lady Margaret replied firmly, "we move forward as a family that has chosen honor over prejudice and love over convention. Camilla, you have two choices. You can accept Catherine as Charles's wife and learn to work within the new reality, or you can continue your destructive behavior and face the consequences." "What consequences?" Camilla whispered. "Public exposure of everything we've discovered about your past and present conduct," Charles said, though his voice carried no malice. "Loss of your position and income as Duchess Dowager, and complete ostracism from the very social circles you've worked so hard to infiltrate." The threat was delivered calmly, but with unmistakable finality. Camilla seemed to understand that her choice was between gracious acceptance and total ruin. I need time to consider," she said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning," Lady Margaret replied. "We're announcing Charles and Catherine's engagement at the weekend house party, and we need to know whether you'll be supporting the family publicly or whether alternative arrangements need to be made for your future." As Camilla left the dining room in defeated silence, Charles felt the weight of years of uncertainty and family pressure finally lifting from his shoulders. He turned to Catherine, who was watching him with eyes bright with tears of relief and joy. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "There will still be challenges ahead, people who disapprove of your choice." "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," Charles replied, taking her hands in his. "You've shown me what real nobility looks like, Catherine. Not the artificial kind that comes from bloodlines and titles, but the genuine kind that comes from character and service to others." Lady Margaret raised her wine glass in a toast, her voice carrying the authority of age and wisdom. "To Charles and Catherine," she declared, "and to the future of a family that has remembered what honor truly means." As they shared their toast in the candlelit dining room surrounded by portraits of ancestors who had faced their own difficult choices, Charles knew that this was only the beginning of their story together. There would be challenges ahead, political and social obstacles to navigate, and the constant responsibility of living up to the values they had chosen to represent. But they would face those challenges together, armed with love, supported by allies who valued character over convention, and guided by a vision of what aristocracy could become when it served something greater than itself. The storm had passed, and a new chapter was beginning for both the Ashworth family and the woman who would soon become its newest member. 3 months later, in a ceremony that combined ancient traditions with modern values, Charles and Catherine were married in the palace's private chapel, surrounded by family, friends, and representatives of the charitable organizations Catherine had served so faithfully. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself performed the ceremony, and the guest list included both noble families and the families of children whose lives Catherine had touched through her work. Camilla, who had chosen to accept the new reality rather than face social exile, sat in the front row and even managed a gracious smile during the ceremony. Her rebellion had ended not with the destruction she had planned, but with her own transformation from adversary to reluctant ally. As Charles and Catherine emerged from the chapel as husband and wife, the crowd that had gathered to celebrate included not just aristocrats and dignitaries, but hospital workers, literacy volunteers, and dozens of people whose lives had been improved by Catherine's dedication to service. It was, everyone agreed, a wedding that perfectly symbolized the evolution of noble responsibility for a new era. The love story that had begun with a chance meeting at a charity gala had weathered its greatest test and emerged stronger than ever. Charles had learned that true nobility lay not in blind obedience to tradition, but in the courage to stand up for what was right. Catherine had discovered that her worth was not determined by her birth, but by her character and the positive impact she could have on the world around her. And together, they had proven that sometimes, when love is based on genuine respect and shared values rather than mere attraction or convenience, it really can conquer all.